Hi, and welcome to On My Shelf. In today's episode, I will be talking about a book called Nightbooks by J.A. White. Nightbooks is a middle grade book by J.A. White. It is a story about a boy who is caught by a witch, and in order to stay alive, he has to make up scary stories. It's a literary and a horror story, so it kind of goes into the art of writing, which is a really interesting thing, and I'll get to that in a minute. J.A. White is also the author of the Thickety series, which I have not actually read. Nightbooks was the first book I had read by J.A. White, and now, of course, I want to go back and read all of his other books. Nightbooks was the kind of story that was really hard to put down, and I don't say that lightly because I'm kind of a person who is tied to schedule, and so when I have a certain amount of time, I'll set a timer, and that's about what I'll read. And it's not ever really hard for me to put a bookmark in a book and come back to it later. But this book in particular was one that was really hard to put down. And I tend to gravitate toward middle grade books anyway. But the whole time I was reading this, I kept thinking, I just want to share this with my sons. And a lot of them are in the middle grade age group. And so it was just a really great story. Not only a great story, but it was also written really well. And I feel like J.A. White had the right mix between scary, but not too scary, because I'm kind of a lightweight when it comes to horror stories. My oldest son reads Stephen King sometimes, and I can't do Stephen King. So this was kind of a good, scary middle grade that wasn't too much for me, that would make me have nightmares and that sort of thing. So I feel like it's also a really good one for kids who are kind of just coming into that wanting to be scared mindset, because they tend to go through that stage of wanting scary stories. But it was also a very literary book, and as I mentioned before, kind of took apart the process of storytelling, because in the story, the main character Alex has to write scary stories in order to keep his life with this witch. J.A. White touches on some of the kinds of things that writers go through, like writer's block and trying to keep suspense in a story and those kinds of things. And I thought that was really clever. Reading Nightbooks, it was very clear to me that J.A. White has a really solid understanding of story structure. His pacing was right on. As I mentioned before, it was scary but not too scary. He has knowledge of middle graders and the kinds of things that they're looking for and the stories that will engage them. And I appreciated that from a craft perspective. I also really enjoyed the stories that were interspersed throughout, because Alex was writing stories for this witch in order to stay alive. He also included some of those stories and even some of the stops and starts that Alex had. He would start a story and then decide, this one's not all that great, so I'm going to scratch it out. And I just found that, especially for kids who are just learning how to write. And I know in a lot of places that I visit, the kids think that they do one draft and they're done. And it was really helpful for me to see an author put that into a book, to say, my first draft is not the draft that you see, which is kind of what Alex, the main character, went through. He didn't want to show the witch this first draft. He wanted to make sure that he made it perfect because his life kind of depended on it. So I really loved the way that J.A. White interspersed those stories throughout the overall story, and it seemed almost like a breaking of the fourth wall, but not quite, because it was stories that the main character wrote, that he was writing to entertain this witch, but also to entertain us. It was just really cleverly done. Not only did Nightbooks make me want to take out an old middle grade horror story that I had written a year ago and kind of dust it off and try my hand at it, but it was also a reminder to look at the stories and see ways that we could incorporate something to make it more than just a story. So in Nightbooks, as I've mentioned several times, J.A. White took readers through the process of storytelling, through the brainstorm process, making lists of story ideas and figuring out which one is the best story to take. It made me think about how we can use these subtle little ways to teach, especially the middle grade crowd, certain things that we know, and hide it within a story and just make it fun for kids to actually learn something at the same time that they're reading, but not in a way that is didactic or obvious even, but in ways that inform the story as well. I feel like that's a question that every writer should ask when they come to a new manuscript is, how can I make this about more than just the story? And whether that's theme or something bigger that they want to communicate to the audience, it's just always a good question to consider before writing anything. And this book kind of illustrated that for me, and the ways that we can creatively engage our audience in things that we know and things that might be interesting to them as well. That's it for this week's On My Shelf. If you want an author's perspective on books, movies, TV shows, and sometimes even music, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.